Hello, everyone. Hi, welcome. I'm Barbara Boswell, and I'm delighted to see a sold-out audience for this wonderful panel. Welcome. This discussion today is part of a series on African cities as text, a partnership between the Open Book Festival and the University of Cape Town. And if you're interested, there's a table with information about the project where you can also help us map the literariness of Africa and African cities. So please do stop by. I'm going to introduce our panelists now and look forward to a wonderful discussion on Cape Town as a text and the city and writing the city. So I'll start with Patric Tariq Mellet, who was born and raised in Salt River, Woodstock, and District 6 in Cape Town. He's a former member of the Liberation Movement who returned from exile in 1990. In 2019, the Minister of Sport, Arts and Culture appointed him to the Governance Council of the South African Heritage Resources Agency. He is the author of, I think his most well-known work so far, is The Lie of 1652, A Decolonized History of Land, a radical critique of colonial history of Southern Africa. He has just published his beautifully moving and historically very deep memoir, or he published it last year actually, called, I've lost my place now, Cleaner's Boy, A Resistance Road to a Liberated Life. And he's also just, I've just learned, published a biography on Reggie September, which is also available for sale outside. Welcome, Patric.
Thank you.
Caryn Dolley is an award-winning journalist and author of 3 books based in South Africa. Her books are The Enforcers, Inside Cape Town's Deadly Nightclub Battles, To the Wolves, How Traitor Cops Crafted South Africa's Underworld, and the one that we'll be discussing today is called Clash of the Cartels, Unmasking the Global Drug Kingpins Stalking South Africa. Also available outside in the Homecoming Center for sale. Caryn has worked as a journalist at the Daily Maverick, as a researcher at non-profit organization Open Secrets, the Amabungane Center for Investigative Journalism, and has been deputy news editor and an investigative reporter at News 24, an online publication. Caryn has also been a reporter at titles including the Sunday Times, as well as the Cape Times and the Weekend Argus. So she has a distinguished career as an investigative journalist and author, and has won awards for her work. Then we have Rhys. Welcome, Chase.
Thank you.
An award-winning author, columnist, playwright, novelist, and screenwriter. Their debut novel, Kinders, received the K. Salo-Duyker Award and Kyknet Rapport Prize, and is an adaptation of a play by the same name. Chase writes a bi-weekly column for Rapport called Seikewate, and Chase writes in Kaps. And also, so the collection that we will be discussing today is called Misfit, Stories van die Ander Kant, a compilation of their weekly columns and also short stories that have been published elsewhere and brought together in this beautiful, sad, tragic, hilarious collection, which is so enjoyable to read. So this particular collection is really looks at tales inspired by Chase's lived experience as a neurodiverse, agender, and queer person. And I think we can speak a little bit about that later, because I have a question about place and identity. And so I thought to kickstart us, I would ask each writer to read an excerpt from their particular text. And I wanted to start with Patric, if you would please get the ball rolling for us.
So this is an excerpt from Cleaner's Boy, the autobiography. And let me start. In the heart of District 6 stood 7 stone steps, which became one of the symbols of the neighborhood that lived in the hearts of all who loved, worked, played in District 6. For me in later life, those 7 steps came to symbolize the 7 tributaries that make up Camisa African identity, or what the regime had called colored identity. That is, the roots within the indigenous communities of Khoi, San, Khunkwebe, Xhosa, the second one being slave heritage, African and Asian enslaved peoples. The third being those people that were called free blacks. The fourth, the people who were called Oorlam or Drosters or Maroons. The fifth, the people who were runaway Europeans from the Cape Colony, usually criminals, and then black exiles and refugees, and then black sailors, indentured laborers, and economic migrants. It's this whole mix that we talk about as having a Camisa African identity. It was in District 6 as a child that I came to understand the violation of apartheid. It was there that I first heard the names of those who stood up for the poor and against colonialism and racial oppression. Dr. Abdurrahman, Clemens Kadali, Mangena, Plaiki, Sisi Gool, Moses Kotane, John Gomas, James Laguma, Mandela, September, Khan, Alexander, Snitcher, and many more. They were a mix of liberals, socialists, communists, trade unionists, and African national liberationists. The stories of these great people, together with the daily reminders of poverty around me, the effect of apartheid on my own family, and the declaration of District 6 as a whites-only area, followed by its physical destruction, lit a fire within me to struggle against the aberrations and atrocities of apartheid. This is where one of my identities, the resistance man, was born. District 6 was a place that made people think. It was creative and had a great culture and character despite the austerity. It was full of life. So many characters remain fixed in my mind. The music, the smells, the fafi, as Chinese numbers game, and gambling on the jijis, horse racing, religion, politics, and many more forms of cultural expression that blended into a unique Cape Creole culture.
Thank you. Caryn, would you mind reading an excerpt?
So this is obviously from Clash of the Cartels, a subsection called Divide and Rule. So desperate were apartheid stalwarts to keep clinging to control of South Africa, they concocted plans to suppress anyone who got in the way of their corrosive ideals. Their group areas of Act of 1950 segregated residents according to skin color and had a horrific ripple effect. It bolstered gangsterism. Communities were ripped up, divided according to race. Those with darker skins were dumped in poorly resourced areas far from central business hubs. Some of those discarded residents grouped together and turned to crime. So while people tried to quilt themselves back into communities and stitch together a sense of belonging, gangs also started donning themselves together. As these groups developed and proliferated, gang hotspots and strongholds emerged in apartheid dumping grounds. In 2022, a court judgment relating to a murder case in South Africa's Western Cape province said gang violence has long been rife in the areas on the outskirts of Cape Town, commonly known as the Cape Flats. Gangs have their roots in the apartheid forced removals, where communities were moved from their old neighborhoods in or near the city center to the wastelands which make up the Cape Flats. Gang violence continues today, unabated, making everyday life a hazardous business for the residents of those areas. Shootings and bullet-ridden bodies have become a daily occurrence in the gang-ravaged areas. Another scar of apartheid is often visible in South Africa's courtrooms. It is not unusual to see older white lawyers representing younger colored and black gang suspects. In South Africa and abroad, the country's gangsterism pandemic, partially a byproduct of Apartheid's Group Areas Act, is largely viewed as a so-called colored or black problem. That thinking, though, is outdated and deluded because gangsterism has never been confined to only certain skin colors. The reality is that while gang-linked crime may grip some suburbs more violently by virtue of the area's history in relation to apartheid, gangsterism was stoked by white politicians under that regime. It manifests in various forms and permeates across perceived color divides. A gangster by any other name or race would connive and kill just as keenly.
Thank you. Yeah, I think these are so interesting to read together because what Patric's excerpt, you start off with sketching this community, a very hybrid, mixed, and a peacefully coexisting community which shaped you in a way. And you go on in your text then to describe what the forced removals were like and what they did to communities. And where Caryn's picks up is the consequence that we see of that. And I think this is such an important link to make. And something that I find common to all of your texts is that the idea of history so profoundly shapes the future. We are not beyond history or away from history. The past bleeds into the future. Colonialism, the violence of apartheid, the dispossession, and the consequences that we see of that in the way in which gangsterism and other social ills and scourges have developed in the city. I'm going to ask Chase now to read from their collection.
Yeah, this is Sandy from Scarborough. I did read this before, but Barbara has asked me to read it. Ek woon in die Kaapse hyper-segregated Deep South. Die mense wat die lentelgordijn definieer, is kaalvoet, vegan en gedrapeer in tie-dye. Hulle werk hard om in harmonie met die natuur te leef. I mean, die is immers waar hulle my octopus teacher gefilm het. Maar hulle doen min om met hulle ander menslike bure te integreer. Hier is ons so ontkoppel van mekaar dat dit steeds 'n anomaly is as ons persoonlike wêrelde mekaar kruis. Soos toe die vrou met dreadlocks en 'n stick-on glitter bindie op haar voorkop, die week by my voordeur uitgestiek het. Namaste, I'm Sandy from Scarborough. Would you like to buy a bag? Sy hou 'n sak van hemp op met 3 woorde daarop en lees voor soos 'n foundation face onderwyser met haar vinger. Wys sy na elke embroidered woord. Live, love, laugh. Ek frons vir die platitude en wil nie dankie sê, maar Sandy is een van die mense wat heeltyd direk in jou oë staar. Sy kyk nooit weg nie. Ek voel ongemaklik en miskien 'n bietjie guilty. Omdat ek kan sien dat sy die sak self gemaak het en dis haar art. En ek wil mos nooit 'n artist ontmoedig nie. Ek sê, dis 'n baie nice font. Lieg ek nou? Sy sê nie, dis magic bags. Ek het my kristals daarin gehou om dit met geneseende energie deur die materiaal te dring. Kyk, ek weet die area wemel van weekends, maar wat se doekom verkoop die vrou hier by my voordeur? Sandy verduidelik al aan sonne om oog te knip. Dit maak nie saak waar jy is nie, as jy iets negatiefs met jou gebeur. Gooi jy net my sak oor jou skouers en lees hierdie 3 woorde. Dit sal jou remind om te live through it, love it, or just laugh at it. Ek kyk oor haar skouers na die 3 shady jongens wat vinnig in die pad afhaloop. Hoekom verkoop jy jou sakke hier, vra ek haar. Sy sê sy moes haar catering besigheid sluit weens lockdown en embroidery was net 'n hobby, maar nou wil sy nog geld daaruit verdien. Ek sê, het jy ander designs? Sy wys 'n ander sak waarop just say namaste gestik is. Langs die woorde is daar kleine embroidery diere en familiefigure van mans met spiese. Ek sê, is jy suppose om sand rotskuns te wees? Sy sê, ja, presies. Ek was op 'n silent retreat in die Drakensberg en ek was so geïnspired deur die beelde op die rotse. Ek het gedink ek moet dit embroider. Ek het gehoop daar was 'n rede agter die artistic choice om die 2 verskillende kulture so te juxtapose. Miskien wou Sandy 'n statement maak oor Suid-Afrika se mengelmoes identiteit en geskiedenis. Ek sê maar namaste is mos Indian, né? En die is local sand rock art. Sandy knik haar knop, sy sê ja. Ek sit die nama in namaste. Toe ek haar vra of dit reg is om kultuursimbole te gebruik wat sy glad nie eens verstaan nie, loe Sandy vir my die nou gestrekte oor, eintlik is ons almal Bushmen. 'n paar gunskote klap in die verte. Sandy se oë skiet wyd oop van paniek. Sy gaan net dadelik plat voor my voordeur. Ek sê, "Ai, kyk, there's a guru on my stoep." Joke ek nou van my oor is al ou gewone die ontploffings. Ek sê moenie worry nie, hulle is in 'n ander pad. Sandy Beaver so haar bindie val skoons van haar voorkop af. Hoe kan julle so leef? Ek trek my skouers op en sê we live, love, laugh through it. Sandy wil eers wag om haar seil klaar te maak. Sy het eers goodbye gesê en sy loop net vinnig na haar kar toe. 'n Opgeblaaste pink jougebol rol van een kant na die ander op haar backseat so sy wegjag.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think this is a good place to start with the subtitle of your collection. It's called Stories van die Ander Kant. And all three of you tell a kind of a story from a different perspective, from the glossy picture postcard idea of Cape Town that we are sold. And it begs the question, from the other side, whose side? And is this a question that I want to ask all three of you to answer? When you were conceiving of and writing the text that we're discussing today, what were the kinds of histories and perhaps hidden things that you wanted to bring to the fore with your narratives? And can I start with you, please, Patric?
Yeah, sure. Look, we start off when we're at school and, and your media and everything, they tell you this is the history story. And immediately it causes, coming from the backgrounds that we do, it causes you to think, but really, is this what actually happened? And I often use this thing that on our old banknotes and coins and stamps, there was always this picture of this handsome Dutch dude who we were told is Jan van Riebeeck. But in fact, it's a portrait that hangs in the Rijksmuseum in the Netherlands of a man by the name of Mr. Vermeiden. And the picture of Maria van Riebeeck is his mistress, Miss Kettering. And so for years and years, we had this plagiarized pictures being presented to us as, the founders of South Africa, so as to say. So confronted with that type of history, the life that we were going through, the life on the streets, my mum was a single mum, the cleaner's boy. My mum was cleaners, and I was the cleaner's boy. She worked in a laundry shop in District 6. And various other places in Salt River and Woodstock and so on. And her life, trying to eke a living in a back room where they wouldn't allow their child, so I had to be fostered out and all of this, and ended up in a real Dickensian children's home. And so that was my life. That was my story, my mother's story. And when I went out to work, it was 10 Rand a week for a 60-hour week for Monday to Saturday. And I thought back and I looked, my mother went out to work when she was 13. I went when I was 15. And when she went out to work, it was 10 cents a day for a 7-day week. Mm-hmm. What had changed between two generations? This was our history. And what we talked about and thought about was nothing like what was in the history books. But there were lots of gaps. And that's where I was inspired to go and investigate the gaps. Elna Boesak, for instance, did a radio program on Radio Sonder Grense, which she entitled Ons Geskiedenis tussen die Krake. And that's what I began to think about. Asking questions, but why? And they range from the personal. I didn't know who my father was. My mother had told me he had died in a motorcar accident in Salt River at the roundabout, and I would later meet him much later in life. He wasn't dead. So I asked really grave questions. I asked, why were we poor? Why could some people have this and we couldn't have that? And that then led to greater questions and so on about our actual history. Did it really start in 1652? Surely there was an African history that goes back thousands of years. What is that history? Again, was Jan van Riebeeck the first European to come here? And I went into the Dutch archive of ships' logs and found that there was over 1,000 ships that came before him. And they had over 120,000 people on them. And they lived here from anything between one group for 9 months, another for 4 months, but nothing less than 3 weeks at a time. Started to put different, perspectives on what I saw around me. And I eventually developed into this person. I don't know if you remember that horror movie where the young child says, I see dead people. And it was bit like that. I'd walk around town and I would know this is where the gallows was, this is where the strafpaal was, this is where the river came out into the sea, the Camisa River, and so on. And I began to see a totally different picture of Cape Town than I knew, both in terms of the formal history that was different, but also of the personal history. We, working people, had forebears who were enslaved. Who were these enslaved people who came from, 105 different locations in Africa and Asia? We were told that our history is simply a matter of white and black mixing, whereas it's a much, much more complex history, and that isn't told. So the history we're given is the history of bosses, famous people, military people, and so on. What about ordinary working people? And that's where everything inspired me to write what I write.
Right, and I think it's such a beautiful biography because what the best autobiographies and memoirs do is they're not only about one person's life, they actually situate a life within larger histories. And I think you achieve that really beautifully to tell your own individual story, but place it within a much larger frame, and you take us far, far back into the history of the Cape. So it's a wonderful way to read and learn about history that you haven't been exposed to, perhaps. And so thank you for that answer. Caryn, with Clash of the Cartels, I saw an interview with you where you said the stories, the books pick me. And you work with such, to me, it seems really dangerous information that puts you at risk and others at risk. So what is it about this particular narrative of the Cape and of Cape Town and of our country and the globe that compels you to write?
Craziness, but yeah. No, seriously, I get really angry when we look at crime and we think, oh, it's typical for a gang shooting to happen in Manenberg. But what underpins that? Who is controlling that? What is actually happening? So for me, what I really wanted to get across is that first, crime has no boundaries. It happens everywhere. And if you follow the money, you will come across crime. So we've had a shooting recently. 4 people were murdered in Constantia, 4 people originally from Bulgaria. And I was so taken aback that people were like, oh, it happened in Constantia. But do you realize that most really good organized criminals have a lot of money? They aren't living in areas where gang shootings happen every day, etc. So yeah, I wanted to get that across. And also, I feel like walking around Cape Town, I have a completely different view of it. Even sitting here or parking near here, I get a bit anxious because the magistrate's court is there, the police station's there, and then we've got a building with scantily clad folks on the facade of the building. And I remember in 2017 when the alleged nightclub takeover, when 2 groups were vying for control of the city's bouncer industry, there were a group of gunmen moving around. I saw them. It's a long story, but anyway, I stood outside the strip club and you could see them arriving, and the one guy, I didn't have specs at the time, and I thought it was like a third leg or something, and I was looking, he had a rifle on him. And this is happening right here in the city center on a Saturday night when people are going out and about, and it's so dangerous. So I really wanted to get that across. And then in terms of the world, I do believe that what we see in Cape Town, what we see in South Africa are flashpoints of global organized crime. Okay. And we really, if we can understand that, great. And the SAPS, South African Police Service, via their communications departments, just don't give us that info. And I really wanted to crack it open and show it.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, what struck me really when I read your book, and this is my first book of yours that I read, and I'm going to read the others also now, but is how embroiled Cape Town is in this global globalized criminal networks, and it's all over. You map out Colombia, Spain, Ireland, Afghanistan, India. It's the kind of the way in which it's such a successful global capitalist enterprise, and the technologies that are available. And then the other thing that struck me, I read Patric's book first, was that those points of how the Cape got started in colonial narratives, right? The origin stories of the Cape as a refreshment station, as a stop-off point. Once again, we have Cape Town and Durban, these ports, these port cities that are functioning in very similar ways. So it's really interesting to see how these really evil systems of empire and global criminality are replicated in these ways. And for me, such a telling marker of how the past really shapes the future, and in this particular way. Of course, at that time, slavery wasn't classified as a criminal network, but it was like a huge system of human trafficking. And those parallels were just so interesting to me, to see that happening. I wanted to ask, just to stay with your book for a moment, about how you gather your information, because I read your footnotes quite closely. I was very interested, and you cite such vast sources. You have the TRC recordings, for example, the testimonies. You have obviously judgments from the courts. You have other statements, but I'm sure that you've cultivated also many, many sources and people that you need to protect in doing this work. How do you go about that, and how do you live in your ordinary life while you are really dealing with some of these really heinous things that you are seeing and reporting on and recording?
So I can't really answer that because I'm living it.
Okay.
I don't really look and think. I mean, I do actually. Wait, let me rather answer it like this. If I go out, I'm very conscious of where I'm going and who may be the. I mean, I was at Canal Walk about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I bumped into someone who is linked to someone in this book. And so it's, for me, Cape Town isn't the Cape Town that is represented to the public or tourists. And it's difficult, but yeah, it is what it is. Let's put it that way. And in terms of cultivating sources and stuff, in a sense, I'm lucky because I'm a journalist and I'm doing this every single day. So for a book, I literally just have to really bring together all these strands of information. And also politicians. I feel that the truth will always come out, history will show it, and politics is a huge, solid support beam of organized crime, absolutely, without a doubt. I mean, I'm not going to mention any letters of the alphabet, but yeah. So yeah, it is what it is. I'm living through it. And
how do you protect yourself when you do this work?
Pepper spray. No, I'm serious. I basically have a pepper spray, and like I said, if we publish something about a certain gang, then I just don't go out. And when I sit in court and I hear of these places, or if I'm reading things and I'm like, oh my gosh, this person owns that place, I just won't go there, and I'll make sure that no one I know goes there, but with reason. And it's scary, folks. It's really scary. You think of organized crime as this thing that's separate to us. It isn't. I'm not going to mention anything, but fish and chips. Go have fish and chips. Be careful of where that fish comes from. Sorry.
Okay.
Whoa,
Chase has a question.
what do you mean?
I'm not going to say
No,
anything.
it's not safe. It's not safe to say.
Meet me outside.
Are we safe on the stage?
Oh, okay.
Can we turn the house lights up so I can see?
Moving on to then sources, and I'm going to move on to you now, Chase. And I love this collection so much for so many reasons, because there are many different stories. They're really tragic stories. There are moments in all of these books, but in yours there were also moments where I had to just put the book down and breathe and say, oh my gosh, I can't believe what I just read. But you are kind of mining the everyday life and life in Ocean View, a community, and you document so beautifully your tools, your notebooks, and the pencils, and how you like to sharpen your pencils, and how you, and even the wood shavings, you know, of the pencils, and it evoked so many memories for me, also a pencil nerd. Can you talk a little bit about, and you have the pressure also, I mean, Caryn also has that pressure, but this weekly column that has to come out, or twice a weekly column, or twice bi-monthly, I don't know what it is.
Twice a month.
Twice a month,
Yeah.
yes. So, you know, and you're writing about people in your community, and how does that work, and what is the ethics of that, of representing people in this way, and taking notes of your neighbor, for example, the conversations? You immediately go and run to that
Yes.
notebook.
I have friends who are like, "Oh, yeah, is this going to be in a column now?" You know, like any experience we have, but it's all in fun, all in like jest, I guess. Like my work, I've suddenly lost my voice. This is so weird. But my work has a lot of humor in it, and I don't sanitize the people that I encounter. Like, I do speak quite honestly about the community. I do try, my main thing is to try to be aspirational with my community so that the people who are from the community can read it and aspire to something. So this book is classified as fiction, because although everything is based on reality, the characters, I often change the genders, or I change the age of the people, just so that, because the story is still there, but it doesn't have to be Auntie so-and-so, my neighbor, you know, and her full name. But I also often combine people. Like the main character in my book, besides me, is called Nana. And
Yes.
Nana is my experiences with different women. Like, there's a few of them, but different women and my experience of them. And they all become this person called Nana. So, because I am very much aware of, like, I don't want to tell somebody else's story. I don't want to be responsible for how I represent them. So I employ and enjoy the elements of fiction that I inject into the work.
Do you have people that are waiting for the column to come out to see, am I in it?
Probably.
I'm sure you do. I'm sure the readership, the circulation of Report has increased quite a bit since you started.
But the thing, thank you. The thing is, I don't know who's reading it. Like, I just sit in my room and I send it out, and I don't read the Netwerk 24, like, comment section, because it is online, but I would refuse to read that. So I don't know who these people are that are reading it. So when I do get feedback, it is a bit like, oh, people are reading this, like, you know?
Yeah.
I have it, no.
I want to come back to you, Patric, and thinking about place and identity, and what is so much bound up in place. When we read texts together about places, I'll ask students to read the place or the city, like Welcome to Our Hillbrow, or Cape, or 13 Cents. Read the place as a character, and if that has occurred to you when you were writing as Cape Town, I know you document your exile, your years in exile, you leave Cape Town, you have a very painful childhood, and the experiences that you convey in the book, you know, they're moving because they are so extremely distressing, and that you are able to reflect on that with such clarity, I think. Is quite remarkable, and I want to just talk about how, you know, your identity, how you feel your identity is shaped by place through writing. Also, the last chapter in your memoir is titled Identity. You do quite a lot of reflecting, so please tell us about that.
Great. Well, just before I say that, something that I thought about when you were talking, the great Dr. Abdurrahman used to have a column called Straatpraatjies, which is very much what you're doing. So you can see that in our history, Dr. Abdurrahman was one of the founders of the African People's Organization in 1902. And he died in, 1946, I think it was. But he had this column. It was an anonymous column. But afterwards, it came out that it was him, his column. But coming to what you've spoken to me about, when writing this book, I must say that I often found myself crying throughout. It was about 3 times the size of what it got redacted to eventually. So memory is painful. And a lot of the memories are painful. They're memories personal, but they're also memories about place, as you have said. I mean, I've lived and worked in 32 countries around the world. And in all of these countries, I've found places that were like the place I grew up in. And, I was quite nomadic as a homeless child, but one of the areas was a small enclave which it runs from where the Palace Bioscope is in Albert Road in Salt River, through to Cole Street with Lower Main Road, then Rochester Road and Sealer Street and so on. And that. In that area is what they used to call in those days a grey area. Far from being grey people, we were very colourful people. But there was a tendency, social workers used to be like policemen that would come there and check up on you, particularly dysfunctional families or single-parent families, or families where the family was too dark but had one light one, or were too light and had one dark one, and then they would literally take children away and put them into terrible homes, orphanages, and so on. There's a whole range of things like that was part of my Cape Town. We called that by the nickname of Diswai, that area. And that goes back to the factor that it was actually where Jan van Riebeeck had his first farm called Uitweg. And Uitweg basically was the curve, the swing, which becomes Lower Main Road, which goes up to Upper Main Road. So that sense of place as a kid was very strong in me, but it was always linked to mainly painful memories. And then, of course, I have the District 6 memory. And again, if I go to New York, to Harlem, and so on, you see images in east of London, in Spain, everywhere. You see this place. I often, although I was in exile for 13 years, I was often drawn to visiting places that resonated with what I grew up with. And I realized that there's this international element of poverty, of people who find themselves in between. And people used to call us half-Nazis, because, and in official apartheid law, there was a category called other colored, which, we had that hovered over us as an identity. Very few people realize today that there was actually 7 categories of colored. Other colored was just one of those 7. But it captured the half-Nazi experience. There were other people that would talk about, those are the people with the touch of the tar and things like that, So you constantly had this interplay between being identified from without in a kind of derogatory way, your own sense of who am I that grows with you. And I always tell people this notion of identity as something singular. It's nonsense. It doesn't exist. From the moment you are born to the moment you die, you collect identities and you discard identities, plural. And if you really think about it, a woman has a different identity to a man. If you're working as a printer, you have the printer's identity. There is so many. If you're homeless, you have a homeless identity. For instance, I was listening to statistics about Africa, and it almost came across that if you've never been a refugee in your life, you can't be an African. Because the vast majority of Africans, at some stage in their life, are refugees. And the refugee experience itself, which I had, it has its own pains. And so you build this identity over life, but we are told by society that identity is a race, it's a color, it's what language you speak, it's what religion you have. And all of these things are what make people go to war against each other, why people slaughter each other over identity politics. But you cannot ignore it. And so what I've tried to do in my work is to try and show people how to use a different kind of lens on how they look at identity, which leaves out nothing, and also emphasizes the ties that bind us across these various divides. And that's what apartheid did. It divided us. And one of the greatest failures post-liberation is that we have not tackled the siloing of people into these rigid racial, colorist identities. How can you be free? How can we have liberation when we still have this kind of framework? And I often pose it as new wine being poured into old apartheid wineskins. And you know what happens. The new wine becomes vinegary. It also splits the old wineskins. And that's what we're experiencing today. What Caryn writes about, organized crime, we can actually trace it back to the sanctions busting. It starts then. And what we find is afterwards, these sanctions busters and the whole criminal network that established then didn't fold up their arms and say, now we'll curl up and die. They simply repurposed. So there's economic, there's social, there's political, historical, lots of things that go into this issue of identity and identity today. And unfortunately, ethno-nationalism is as alive and well as it's always been. And we're just at the beginning of seeing how bad it really can become.
Yeah, that's quite a sobering assessment. There's this retreat into these identities that we have. You know, it seems like there was a moment of freedom where we could imagine or reimagine ourselves differently. But I want to pick up on a point where you were talking about, that Caryn highlights also in her book, which is an important one, the genesis of this corruption and this organized crime that we see now. And in the 80s, the way in which the apartheid state actually injected drugs into communities. And can you talk a little bit more about that and how you see that playing out in the current moment, Caryn?
Absolutely, and it's something I'm not done with yet. I mean, I'm most definitely not done with this aspect, and I say that seriously because there are people in, obviously, democratic South Africa, in public office, past and present, who have literally, in my opinion, got away with murder. Because what you had under apartheid was the then government manufacturing and distributing drugs, including Mandrax. And I'll focus on Mandrax because it will take us through to, right now. But yeah, we had the apartheid government manufacturing and distributing intentionally, and then you'll see, if you read between the lines, folks, they're very obvious lines, go to the chapter on India, you'll see that the ANC was also allegedly involved in trafficking Mandrax. And remember, it was banned under apartheid. They needed money. So the story goes that several individuals with the ANC were distributing Mandrax as well, okay? And what happened post-1994 is that some of those individuals did not stop. And that's why I make a hugely strong argument, which is fact, that the drug routes that are active today, and when I say drug routes, I mean, I'm talking drug trafficking and drug ravaging, because they are literally hurting and harming people. What we see today can be traced way back. And I go into the 80s and 90s, but it goes way further back. And again, like I said, I hope those individuals, and sadly some of their names had to be redacted for legal reasons, but I genuinely hope the truth does come out, because some of them are part and parcel of cementing South Africa in the global drug trade. And I think it's the worst kind of treachery, because those people in past and present office have literally sold out people's safety in the worst way. And they sit in, I just have to tell you this, sorry, and now I'm like gossiping a little, but
Please.
I was writing about someone who is involved in these circles, and this person just would not give me comment. It was several years ago, and I was in Joburg, And I was sitting in this weird little restaurant, and the person walked in. And I was so tempted to walk up and be like, please answer my questions. We know you did this. What have you got to say for yourself? But I couldn't. I also had flu and I had no voice. But this person was sitting there drinking like 2 bottles of bubbly and having a fabulous time. So, I mean, anyway.
Gosh. Yeah, and we see, again, to bring it to your text, Chase, the consequences so much, and how this community that you write about with such humor and empathy and love, how it's also ravaged by this scourge. And you portray this really bittersweet nature of reading your text, because on one hand, one's laughing, and there was one point where I laughed probably for 5 minutes straight just by myself. The lollipop vignette. But you show with such empathy the consequences of these in how the relations are ravaged and people's souls are ravaged and bodies. Yeah.
I do feel like my work is absolutely leading on from the history, and I am showing this is where we are today. Vandag sit ons so, today these are what our addicts look like. This is what they, this is how we are living now because of all these things. So I feel like it's a lovely timeline. Not a lovely timeline, but it's a timeline.
A Cape Townian timeline, a Southern African timeline. Yeah. Let me open up to questions from people in the audience. I'm sure there are lots and lots of questions. I can't see anything. Are there any hands?
Yeah, you can see us, we can't see you.
Yeah.
I speak. Oh. Hi. Chiram could see. Yeah. I think your books are also important. Caryn, it's not even a question, it's a comment actually. I recently moved back to Uitzicht, which is part of Elsie's. Most people don't know Uitzicht, they know Uitzicht. Uitzicht is a wine farm. I come from Uitzicht. And I started questioning the kids and I started working with them. And I asked them one question, show me a house in Uitzicht where there is not a tikkoop, where there is one that did not come from, a drug addict that did not come from that house. Show me one house where that did not happen. And at first, the response is, whoa, we don't know a house like that. We don't know about that. But only later on do they go, yes, maybe we can find one, maybe. And even the religious homes, there's one there. So I think your book is really, your work speaks to that. Also looking at the way that other people view Uitzicht. When I say I'm from Uitzicht, people grab their bags immediately. It's like, whoa. And then taking that further and going into a store. I have a brother that's 13. I need to teach him how to walk into a store. And I'm constantly battling with how do we get over these things? These kids growing up, they see gangsterism, but they have other dreams. I know one, Liam, he works with doves, he loves birds, he has a calling, he calls birds, but we don't know these stories. We only know it's the gangs. And I went to one of the Ravensmead police station, I went there and I was like, can you tell me something else? What are you guys doing? And the response is mostly, but they are just like that. And I said, no, yeah, I am. I'm not like that. I am trying to do something else. Where are you with this? What are you doing? Do you just accept the things that have been happening? And I think your work speaks to how we ask those types of questions. So thank you for that.
That's why it's so important to have colored narratives that are aspirational. You know? That's also a part of the fiction that I put in the work, is that even if this character, or this in real life, this person is nothing that I want to be like, let me make her something that people might want to be like.
To aspire to, yeah.
To aspire to.
Over there's a question? Oh, okay.
So what I'm really struck by, firstly, thank you for the gift of each of your bodies of work, lineages, legacies of work. I'm really struck by the pain of sitting and listening to echoes, really, of work that was done or written through theater, through arts, through NGOs, and is invisible, erased, not documented, so that that's recognition of the myriad other histories that are part of the tapestry of where we are now. Still, I sit with the pain of that still not being in the archives, so that, for example, Chase, you could say, you know, Louine Conning's play from Durban in 1995 was a colored place, and not to say that my work is the lineage of that, but the fact that that resource as an archive of work we have been accomplishing over time, that's part of the same kind of erosion, a bit like a drug in a way, that kind of corrosive element of national budgets being removed from arts in education, from ill equipment of teachers by putting lip service to arts as a subject in schools and seeing it only as some kind of embroidery or add-on. Politicians being given the arts and culture portfolio as if you're the naughty guy, so you can go in the corner and have that portfolio. People many times who had no understanding of arts activism, to use that phrase, because that's not even what we'd call ourselves. There's no difference between what we were doing politically. It's just a different methodology, and very much a front line in terms of liberation work, but invisibilized. So, and there have been many projects trying to document that history of what the projects through the arts and culture movements were doing. So it's a sad thing to see that even, you know, those conversations also are still we're so hungry for them to happen still. So hungry for archives of that work to be accessible to younger generations. It's more work to be done. So not to be hopeless. I'm celebrating the lineage continues. But those gaps are also about government neglect and ignorance, because the conversations happen top down still, as if we haven't figured that that's not the way. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question over there.
Thank you very much. I think, Chase, my question is directed towards you. So my question is directed to Chase, right? So to what extent can we think of gaps as a space to think the colored identity?
As a what? Sorry?
Gaps, right?
Yeah.
As a space, as a city, as a street, to rethink the colored identity.
The language gaps.
Yes.
To rethink the colored identity.
Yes.
Yes, caps, I'm very much about documenting caps as it is now, which is very varied. You have your different people speak it differently. You have Gael, you have a sort of more like Gael, which is like the queer language. Vast, Vusi. You have sort of Sabella, which is more like gangster, sort of prison language. You have your sort of cake caps, which is like how the auntie who goes to church would
And
speak.
he looks at me
And
as
that is
his
cake
auntie.
cap. But there's all these different variations, and I try to capture, I speak as or I write as the character, and I hope that in writing those different variations, I'm just documenting. I'm not trying to like create a culture. I'm just saying this is how this lady speaks, and this is how I would write it. Yeah.
So there's a roaming microphone, and here's a question down here, and several over here.
Malika comments on the arts as where things disappear to, but in fact, in the mid-90s, there was a whole project on the rewriting of history textbooks for schools and the educational policies, etc. And I know that June Bam was involved with that, and I was peripherally involved with that as well. And nothing came of that. Oh. And unless you can introduce history into school as the telling of stories and not just one linear story, nothing's going to happen. And I think this would be an essential way of rethinking the story, the narrative of not only South Africa, but certainly South African history, but it's got to start at school level.
Thanks. Maybe we can take a few comments and questions. There's someone with a hat over there on that side. whose hand has been up for a long time.
And some-
And at the back also, right at the back.
Hi. Hi. I just wanted to ask a kind of open question about what you all think of trying to orient the conversation in towards the future, specifically trying to explicitly make spaces where we can strive to a future that a future that we can live for instead of or a future that we can live for building on top of the extremely complex histories that come from this city and also the rest of South Africa, and building towards a kind of, I guess, a kind of South African joy, something that sparks hope and gives an explicit direction.
Thank you. Can we take one last question, comment right at the back? And then I'll ask people to respond to everything. If you can just make a mental note of what's being asked.
Hi, everybody. I'm so appreciative of all of these perspectives and also that it gives counter narratives to what people know. I often find that as, in inverted commas, a colored from Cape Town, you always have to explain so much about your identity, about your city, and how it's entrenched in and representative in so many different ways. And I think even if you just, come into the city, look at the castle, and then look at the unhoused next to it, that in itself is a narrative that speaks, so loudly about certain things. And I think I'm the same when I look at geographical spaces around the city, that it just sometimes, het spook daar, het spook oral, het spook hier, I did want to ask you, though, Tracy, in terms of particularly having a column in the report, a weekly column that is CARP. So, and people always have this idea, we also have to consistently re-educate around the narrative about what Afrikaans is as a black language and a brown language, and not just the language of oppression, which most of the country has the idea about, but the variations of Afrikaans. And so I'd like to know, writing every week in the report, which is a very kind of stern textbook kind of stolen version of Afrikaans' language, and then you insert yourself in there. What has the reaction been from the wider readership, especially because I feel like as brown and black people, we understand the variations of Afrikaans. Send me to Worcester, no problem. Send me to Namibia, it's fine. Send me to the Northern Cape, we can gale that gale, we can talk that talk, we understand it. Send me to Paulsmoor, we will survive. But send a white person, 1 to 6, let's frick. So I just want to know, how is it being consumed? Is there we don't understand this? Is it looked at as something that is a voyeuristic thing? Does it for man? Because they can't get it and it's not accessible? Or does it become just another research project that white people look at this language and say, ooh, this interessant, that hierdie, I just want to know.
I was told when they approached me to write the column, that most of their readership are not white Afrikaans people, most of the report readership. But it's brain mense, it's brown people across the country. So immediately, from the beginning, I was like, I'm not writing to be in conversation with white Afrikaans people. My content is not about, like you said, could be voyeuristic, but that's if they want to look. I don't really care, but I'm not in conversation with white Afrikaans people. I'm in conversation with my own community. I'm in conversation with other brain Afrikaans schrijvers and whatever variation they have. Apparently, at the beginning, there was a lot of negative feedback, but we must remember Nathan Trantral has been writing for the report, and he writes in CAPS, so I wasn't the first one in that sort of newspaper conservative context. We have alternate weeks, so 1 week it's they do have the CAPS quote, 1 week it's Nathan, then next week it's me. You can't be both at the same time. At the same time. But there was apparently lots of ons praat die Sunni, and also from brown people saying, ons almal praat die Sunni, we get those people. And I'm saying, yeah, my ek praat so, you know? So there was some backlash apparently, but the people were very nice. They didn't send it to me. Like the editors, I didn't get any of that. I only found out recently that there was backlash when I started like 3 years ago. So I feel very protected, and like I say, I'm not in conversation with that. I don't really care.
Yeah.
Do you want to wrap up with?
When my book, The Lie of 1652, came out, I was actually astounded as to how well it did. In 2.5 years, it's in a 6th reprint. But because of that popularity of that, we said, no, look, how do we actually get to kids? And I took up the dream of Red September. We have this building in Cape Town called the Castle. It's got a history of horrors. And we managed to get 4 rooms at the castle, and we've established what we call the Camisa Museum there, in which we have an exhibition, or permanent exhibition, on the 195 roots of origin of people who are classified as colored. And we rather talk about Camisa Africans. What that has done is it allowed programs to be developed there. Now, 70,000 of our kids annually pass through the doors of the castle, and before, they could never see anything about themselves, their history, and so on. Today they can. The teachers come with them. We have a team that works with those teachers and the children, because, you know, children, you've got to develop really very basic soundbite type activities, and where the hands get wet and messy and so on. And so this work is being done. There's a group of 10 people who are on the board of the Camisa Museum. They're doing programs not just locally, but also nationally and internationally with children in other parts of the world. And then in terms of cups, there's now a team of about 4 or 5 young people working together with UWC to produce a trilingual dictionary. There's a lot of things that are being done to take some of the concerns forward. And government is not going to do it for you. I can tell you that straight away. It's never going to, if you wait for government, it's never going to happen. So what we've done is enthused people, giving, in some ways, our books, our works have been a primer. And people have taken the ball and they've started running in various directions with it. And you'd be, you know, astounded to know how much of this type of activity is happening. Interfaces with NGOs, community-based organizations, churches, school teachers, youth groups, and so on. So it's happening. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes it so inspiring to want to write more and more. Because I'm doing a sequel now at the moment on The Lie of 1652, which is about the truth about Cape slavery and the Indian Ocean slave trade. Many of our ancestors, in my case 26 of them, were people who were brought here as enslaved from various parts of the world. And so we're building up a literature. Out of that literature is coming plays, apparel, all sorts of stuff that take the message forward. Young people are not going to read our works per se, but they're going to, somebody's going to interpret it into hip-hop, into mural art, and so on and so on. And you'll be surprised how much of that there is actually happening.
Thank you. Can you have the last word, please,
No, I'm just going to go. I'm going to be very quick, I promise. But in terms of going forward, I think South Africa is built on a lot of lies, and we're only coming to learn of them. Actually, some of us know them, not necessarily me, but some of us know them, and we are learning. And I think it's brilliant what is happening in terms of cases that are being reopened, apartheid cases, like people falling downstairs or hanging themselves when in actual fact they were murdered. Even if their murderers are dead today, it's good that we know, because that gives us a good solid footing to go forward.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you to our panelists. And the books are on sale outside, and the authors will also be signing copies in the Homecoming Center.
And thank you,
Thank
Barbara
you.
Boswell. Thank you.